Welcome everybody to this masterclass today. We call it a masterclass, but I guess I'm going to do my best to make sure it's more of a friendly chat. And to sort of help us along, we have a very eminent panel here today with us. But before I sort of introduce the panel to you, I thought I'd probably ask the audience a few questions. If I could just get a show of hands in terms of how many people here identify themselves as energy folks, primarily energy folks. So, a bit of a mix here, about 30–40%. And how many people out here identify themselves primarily as finance folks? So a bit less. And how many sort of identify themselves as both energy and finance? So clearly what we have out here is I'd say a gathering of people who are primarily energy, a bit of finance, and a bit of both. And I think that really sort of sets the context in terms of the panel topic today, which is energy and finance, and specifically bridging the gap between these two very important fuels or engines of the economy. And to help us today with that, and to help us sort of get some more light into this, we have an eminent panel here today. We have Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who's also on the board of CEEW. We have Ms. Sharmila Shivali from the Northern Railways, who's the Principal Financial Advisor there. We have Kanika Chawla from the Center of Energy Finance. We have Ratan Roy from the NIPFP. We have Varun Sivaram, who's the Chief Technology Officer at Renewable Power. And we have Prashant Baza as well from the Climate Bonds Initiative. So as I sort of move along, I was wondering what the best way to sort of run this panel would be. And one of the things I sort of thought was to sort of frame it in terms of connecting what the objectives are, or at least the outcomes we seek to sort of get from today's discussion, and connect that with the way I would like to perhaps structure this discussion. So what we have today is we have three objectives that we are looking to get answers to by the end of the discussion. And the first objective here is to actually figure out what the challenges are, at least identify the challenges that are on the way or stop us from the mainstreaming of the energy transition. Now, in order for us to actually understand or get some better insight into this, what I will be doing is asking each of the panelists one question, a different question, that hopefully helps everybody here get a better insight. For the second objective, what we have is, the goal of the second objective is to actually debate mechanisms which will actually help us to better understand or better solve or address the energy transition, and to actually come up with potential answers, specific answers, specific solutions which would allow us to actually bridge that gap. For that, in order for us to sort of understand that better, what I will be doing is asking each of the panelists the same question. And for the third, what we have is, the third objective is to actually come up with a proposal. Actually not a proposal, the third objective is to propose that the energy transition, which actually is going to see us going through many, many new technologies, is actually going to require a newer way of thinking, newer way of financing. So those are three objectives, and so without much further ado, maybe we can just start. For the first objective, Mr. Ahluwalia, what I would like to ask you is, you've had years, decades of experience in the policy-making front. The energy transition, as we call it, is something that sort of requires billions of dollars to be mobilized. In your experience, do you recall any sort of incidences or cases or sectors in the past which required such vast amounts of capital to be mobilized for one particular sector or one particular end use? And the second is, do you see the size of the capital raise itself being a risk? It's a challenge for sure, but might it be a risk in that it might tend to crowd out investment for other sectors?
Well, when I agreed to join the panel, I was told that you don't have to know very much substantively. Just come and shake things up a bit. So you put me on the spot by asking the first question. I hope that's not a function of age or this guy asking this first question. But let me do a little bit of the shake. I would sort of pose a provocative question. There's kind of a tendency for this energy and finance thing to sort of feel that there's somebody is at fault. I mean, the renewable energy guys think they're doing a wonderful job, technology is marching forward, I mean, etc., etc. And the only reason that it's not being financed is there's something wrong with the finance guys. And my limited knowledge of the finance guys is that, they're trained to spot a financing opportunity. They're not trained to do good things. So an energy transition may be a good thing, but if you haven't created the revenue model that would make it happen, don't expect any finance guy to rush in. So I'm putting forward the proposition there isn't a problem on the financing side. The problem is that we don't have a revenue model that a financing guy can come in with. A lot of what people say capital is needed is confusing, as it were, commercial capital with grant capital. Now, for example, if you need, for virtually anything, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, it can be done if it's on a grant basis. I'm assuming that that's not the name of the game in renewable energy. Kanika is telling me that about 10% of our actual electricity, not energy, but actual electricity, is not capacity, but actual electricity, is now coming from renewable. That's a pretty substantial area. So really, if that is so, you need to look at, is there a revenue model that's working? And if it's working, then you're going to get the finance necessary. Now, if you suddenly want to take it up from 10% to 40%, it's not clear to me that technically you're capable of doing that. And if you are going to do it beyond this 10% level, there's a lot of other investment that has to be put in to balance the grid properly. It's not clear that people are willing to pay for that. And I think that is what's holding back a lot of the flow. Of course, everything crowds out everything else. So that's not an interesting issue. If there's total capital for X amount of growth, then there must be enough for the energy requirement. Within that, the question is, will it go to renewable or will it not? I think if the renewable has a good revenue model, there's no reason why it won't get financed.
Yeah, Kanika?
Can I ask you a question in response?
I thought you were going to answer my question. Fine, go ahead.
When you said that it isn't clear to you, that it isn't clear to you that technically it's possible to scale up the share of renewable energy in the generation mix, right? And this is in fact exactly the problem. With the exception of the converted who work in the sector, the science and the existing evidence is, even though it's compelling, it doesn't necessarily percolate through. So how do you make that? How do I make what I know from modeling exercises convincing enough for a non-modeler to really believe that it's true and it's possible?
Well, let me say, it's not a model versus non-model. If you say what I thought, and this is where I'm stretching the limits of my knowledge quite a bit, that if you're going to go from 10% to 30, 40%, and the supply is not continuously available on tap, then the balancing requirement to fit it to whatever the demand pattern is complex. Now, we know that we can help by bringing in fairly brutal time-of-day metering. We haven't done that. And generally in our system, what happens is you want to tick a box. So you tick a box saying, yes, there's time-of-day metering, but the difference between peak and off-peak is so damn small that it doesn't do a hill of beans. So and the question is, have we got around to sort of facing that fact and doing something about it? The other is, of course, that you will need balancing capacity. Whatever turbine, these gas turbines and so on, which will be basically unutilized for a lot of the time. So if you factor in the cost of that, the cost of, if you like, absorbing renewable energy is higher than it seems to be if you assume there's not a problem. Okay? There's another issue here, and it's something which we need to think about. It's not entirely clear to me that the energy sector has actually got a working revenue model independent of renewable energy. Because there's a hell of a lot of conventional guys who are sitting around with power plants, and their problem is, look, we've got this huge power plant. Earlier they used to say we're not getting coal, we're not getting etc. Now the problem is that nobody wants to pay for the power. And the reason nobody wants to pay for the power is that the electricity, the distribution companies, what used to be called the electricity boards, I mean, they're constrained to charge a tariff which just won't cover their costs. And the only reason this is being hidden is that every 10 years or so, the central government, probably advised by NIPFP, pitches in and says, oh, and by the way, I'm responsible for doing a lot of that myself. We find a solution. And what is that solution? We take a whole lot of debts and say, we can't burden the consumer with this, we'll write it off. I mean, the cleverness is the state going to write it off, or is the center going to write it? But this is just not viable. So, I mean, that's not a renewable energy problem, that's an energy problem. And we have to fix that somehow.
I think that really leads me, so am I audible? Okay. So that really leads me to the next question for Ms. Javali. Now, as the energy transition is underway in India, as Dr. Ahluwalia pointed out, India also has the dubious distinction, I would say, of being host to billions of dollars or gigawatts of stranded thermal assets, or assets which are just not economically viable. Now, the way I sort of look at it, and the way I frame it in my mind, is when folks were looking to invest, or actually were evaluating an investment in thermal, perhaps they underestimated the risks. So if they had known the risks, the actual risks that they were exposing themselves to, the tariff that they would have put into the model that would cover the risk would be so high that they would have figured out that it really doesn't make sense to invest, and they would have stopped right there. So these projects would have never got off the drawing board. So an underestimation of risks. Do you feel that in the case of renewables, perhaps due to an overhang effect, or perhaps for some other reason, that risks are being overestimated in this case?
Thank you, Gagan. To answer the second question about renewables, I need to go back to the first issue you raised about thermal. And it also links to the first bullet you have on the theme of what we are discussing. One of the things we need to have is clarity in policy and policy thinking. And that, if it is weak or if it is fuzzy, reflects in the risks that are perceived by an investor. And we are looking at this not as energy sector versus finance sector, but energy and finance working together. There are two distinct groups. The energy guys have the business, finance guys come up with the money. Now, I'm going back to thermal for only one reason. I don't know if you would have, but a lot of people would be, may not be aware that both Germany and Australia are rethinking their approach to how to treat conventional thermal, only because when you have thermal assets like we have in India, is there a way of extracting it? Because there's a cost to ignoring what you have and going straight to renewable, especially when you have a huge amount of sunk stranded costs in thermal. A country like Germany, which had aggressively pushed for avoiding thermal, is now paying for use of thermal. Australia, because it has huge coal assets, is also looking at it. I'm not saying that what India has done in coal thermal is good, but the problem is that if we, and I'm saying this as someone in government who has tried, if we in government don't simultaneously look at cleaning the extraction process in thermal, but jump and want to take this paradigm shift straight into renewables, it's not going to happen. The risk assessment or the overhang of the thermal risk on renewables is actually different from how you stated it. It is not because renewables sees what's happened in thermal and says, oh, that was risky, so this is going to be risky. Renewables was actually intrinsically clashing with thermal because thermal in the conventional public sector bank lending was crowding out the money available for renewables. So you did not have any, and they didn't have a carve-out for renewable in the amount of money that has to be lent by banks. So by the time a smaller thermal renewable plant went to the bank had already reached its sector cap in thermal. So there's no money left. In fact, the first time in the finance ministry we started grappling with this issue was about 7 years ago, where we found that we had turned the financing model, and you're familiar with this, on its head, where in renewables the cost of debt was actually much, much cheaper than the cost of equity, because equity was available. So from the renewables point of view, again, I think I have to reiterate what Dr. Ahluwalia said. You show me a good project and I'll show you the money. There's no dearth of money. Secondly, there is no crowding out per se, because there is a particular class of investor which is looking to invest in renewables. They'll be willing to come in. But what we lack in renewables is, and this is more from the government side, the ability to ascertain what is it, the financing model that will work, where you build up scale by aggregation. The models that we have to build in government, and these models we can launch 100, maybe about 50% of them will actually succeed, but we need to keep launching them, and we need to be very nimble in this. Take the INVIT model, which is now, and since I was there from the start, I know how it started. It had a lot of teething problems. It's now seeing a lot of scale coming. But the INVIT model also needs to be tweaked, because when I was looking at the regulatory structure for INVITs, I put in a lot of constraints over there, knowing that infrastructure as an asset class is risky. So you do not want someone who's not, I wouldn't personally invest in it, because as an individual, I would be slightly wary of it. In the financing sphere, it's separate. That INVIT model can now be tweaked, because renewables are quick to launch, and then you don't need the skin in the game of the developer thereafter. So unless we do that, so I think the issue is not how the overhang of thermal is going to affect the financing of renewables, but A, to deal with the overhang of thermals, because that's affecting my discoms. It's affecting a lot of things where I need to put in, I either need to take out the money from there and invest it somewhere else, I need to utilize these stranded assets, etc. And renewables in parallel has to take its own path.
Okay, thank you. So what you're saying is, to summarize, is it's possible to look at renewables separate from thermal.
I think you need to.
To pursue it, and what you're saying is money will be forthcoming for the sector without really having that money have that thermal monkey on the back. You know?
Except with one caveat, unless as a government or through policy we address the thermal problems, the risk factor in India as an investment destination will continue, because this sort of affects that.
Sure. Yeah, so that's a common discom risk, common transmission losses, etc.
When you say risk factor in thermal, are you saying the risk factor with energy? Because basically, I mean, we've defined the demand for energy that includes a whole lot of demands which don't intend to pay the price of the energy. So the truth of the matter is, if that's the demand, there's no way that it can be actually met. That's one point. The second, you know, there are simple things which I think would make a big difference. And the two that needs to be brought out, if you look at it as a financing, economic kind of issue. The first is clearly, why are we so bothered about renewables? And the answer is clearly climate change and decarbonization. The logical thing, if you're really serious about that, is to have a proper tax on coal. Okay? Now, we did that. I mean, there is a tax, I forget now, 400 rupees a ton or something like that. If you were to compute the tax that will actually take care of the external cost of CO2, it needs to go up from whatever, 400 to about 3,000 rupees per ton. Now, you know, you never do these things very quickly. But if somebody had a policy decision that said, look, we're going to achieve this in 5 years. 5 years is a long time. But it does mean that every year, the 400 will go to 1,000, will go to 1,500, etc. That will definitely jack up the price of thermal energy and will make the renewable a lot cheaper. And indeed, you could cross-subsidize using the revenues gained to subsidize the thermal. I mean, that's one. The second, to my mind, is that, and I mean, we've been, certainly when I was in government, we talked about it endlessly and got nowhere. And that is this whole business of open access. I mean, if you could implement open access so that the big guys can go directly to an energy supplier and simply pay the DISCOM, what is the reasonable contribution to the fact that they service a lot of low tariff markets, then you'd open up a huge amount of demand. And all these people whose assets are currently stranded would be able to sell their power to a whole lot of people who are willing to buy it. That is frankly held up only at the state government. There's nothing the central government can do. But it puzzles me that there's no state government willing to bite that particular bullet, because it would make a huge difference to the quality of supply which they could offer to their industry in the state. So if you ask me two things, if we're serious, and the rest will, I mean, all these financing guys will sort out the problem. Put a tax on coal and make open access a reality, and you will see what a difference it will make to, if you like, the viability of generating energy.
So, you know, I like... Sure, yeah, please. No,
go ahead.
No, after you.
Sir, my answer is yes and no, because the two basic questions you asked. The overhang of thermal and why I would be reluctant to jack up the price of thermal immediately is we have ignored what was waiting to explode till it became a crisis in thermal, and there is a crisis just now. So for me, the overhang in terms of the effect of coal and conventional thermal is on the risk perception of India as an investment destination for any financial advisor, financial investor. And the reason I say this is, I come back to the source of capital. There's a huge pool of financing, long-term financing and short-term financing available overseas, which is just looking for clean projects. It's just waiting to be tapped. They want to come into countries like India, and they keep speaking to me even now. They want to come in and they're willing to pay that extra price for the risk that we have, a higher risk, but not so high that it jeopardizes the investment. And I come back to what you said about renewables. The reason which is actually I'm conflating a very separate issue here. The reason I say that renewable has to work in parallel is because when you say, you make a policy statement that we have to reach so and so amount of renewables, etc. In renewables, scale is always going to be an issue. I think utility scale, that term itself in electricity is very fuzzy, so we can't use it. If India could spend a lot, and this as a policymaker, if you could see it as the crying problem that we have to address is grid connectivity, microgrids connecting to the national grid. If we could address that, then the other issues also that you're speaking of could be answered.
And that sort of leads me to the next question I have, and that's for Ratan out here. We heard policy, we heard, let's say, interventions that the central government or the state government could do, but they're not doing. The way I sort of look at renewables is one of the main reasons in my mind why it really picked up in India is because the policymakers, whilst maybe not doing all they could have done, were actually able to put in place measures or interventions which in my mind were tailor-made for renewables. So for example, solar parks is one. I think one of the biggest ones was actually getting sovereigns or quasi-sovereigns to execute PPAs. The NTPCs of the world, SECIs of the world. So that really sort of helped mitigate in the minds of investors offtake risk. I think reverse auction for tariff discovery was also a big one, because as much as the developers may not like the fact that PPA tariffs have really, really fallen, in my mind it's impossible to believe that 30 gigawatt of utility scale solar would have been put on the ground at $5, $6, or 7 rupees, or whatever the tariff is. So the tariff itself is a double-edged sword. So I think the question I want to ask you, Ratan, is that with the government having done certain things which I think really helped renewables along, and whilst also recognizing Dr. Ahluwalia said about things that can be done, is it fair to say that policy making for renewables is decoupled or completely decoupled from that of thermal. So therefore, the way we approach policy making for renewables should by and large ignore what happened with the thermal sector or ignore how thermal operates.
I think it's not a binary. I think it depends on what you regard as your overarching function within government and within the policy ecosystem, or what you regard as a policy commentator as a priority. And let me get into this. My only interest in this sphere has nothing to do in my professional job with climate change. I'm not interested. I'm interested in renewables because I've observed over time that they are both cheap and that they're generally productivity enhancing, subject to many of the points that Chapman raised. Because the main issue is interest. That's my interest. So how will I then look at it? I'll say, okay, so we need to, I'm focused on 2022, getting electricity into every household by 2022. And if renewables helps you to do it, then at the policy making level, you will say, okay, here's something that's going to accelerate my journey to powerful world by 2022, and let's look at how we invest it. I'm not even thinking about coal versus renewables. That's happening. Then on top of that, you had Paris. The Prime Minister goes to Paris and says something. Starts the international solar plans. It has to be factored into my thinking then. That I have this overriding policy objective, but now the Prime Minister says we need so many gigawatts of renewables, and then you delve deep and say, how do I make these consistent? It is therefore inevitable with this perspective that you do exactly what Shailen was saying, which is say that renewables are important, but I'm not going to craft policy where looking at relative shares is my overriding objective. Right? I need to meet that gig target, and I need to meet the Prime Minister's 2022 electricity for all target, where I have things to worry about that do not impact renewables, such as my discoms and MS. My own, by the way, won't take my own prescription for that is to bite the bullet like with banking and say that the Indian taxpayer is going to have to make a bailout to the people of India every 15 years. It's happened all my life. You're much older than me. It's happened 4 times in my life. 4 bank crises, 4 power discom crises, and taxpayer money used for each. I'm old enough to say it's going to happen again in 2022. Let's just plan for it wisely. So I don't think that's a big deal. The taxpayer will have to bail out people. I saw a lovely meme, I think it's called today, saying that behind every successful Indian industrialist lies a nationalized bank. So if that's the one, I can't. So you see perhaps what we need in this conversation is from the energy and especially the environment people is a better appreciation of this. Because you're not going to get that if I talk to you, now I can, but if I was there, I'd be very polite with you and say, well, I should do it to the UN. The environment is very important, and renewables are very important, and our children have a common future. And look how I'm saying it is very persuasive, right? But when I go back to my office, I'm saying, oh my God, I need to meet that 2022 target, I need to crack the discoms, and where you can show that renewables help in doing that, which is why now I'm for renewables, that I can actually see them helping do that. I have some niggling questions which are not answered, but those are public policy questions. I have one question is, how much land is all this going to take? And the trouble with talking to very smart CTOs is that they say, there's no land, it's going to be Spider-Man. What do you mean Spider-Man? We're going to put it all up on the sides of buildings. And I'm like, okay. But you will appreciate that even in finance, that capital business model has to be explicated. How you're going to get to the sides of the buildings. We haven't done it before. What kind of contracting would you need? What happens? Will that flow lead to the building? Will it join the grid flow? If the Indian Railways is going to run around with sort of electric engines that are sucking in solar power, as some people have told me, then what will that world look like? Will I have stranded assets there in terms of depots, wagons? And the most important question for me coming from batteries is, what are we going to do with all these solar panels when we have to jump them? And is that built into project cost? So all these things, I think at this level of granularity, there is a lot of work that can be done to educate the finance people. Because these are public policy questions, these are all finance questions, because everything I've said here represents a potential future project risk of which I have no experience before. One final point I want to make, I would not agree with your description of India's coal assets as being stranded. I think what has happened is that our energy assets are in trouble because our discoms are in trouble and therefore there is no offtake. And the offtake that we ought to have at the right price, there's a pricing problem, and therefore there's an offtake problem, and therefore we have an asset financing issue, right? That asset is going bad because of these two reasons. I don't think my coal assets are stranded, and I agree with you. I think most importantly, we have to look at, I did this years ago, 4 years ago, before Paris, what we can do to make our coal more efficient. And the good news is that if we actually mine our coal, transport our coal to power plants and modernize them, take it which way you will, I'm agnostic. For the same level of emissions today, I can increase my coal power output. That still doesn't solve my pricing problem. By 20%, or I could reduce emissions by about, 14%, and maintain my current levels of coal output. And obviously that could be a policy priority. So I think that is that, and for all these reasons, the Sharmila is right. In the medium term, we will be looking at renewables, not in terms of relative share with coal, but in terms of what it can do to achieve our power sector development aspirations.
So almost renewable standing on its own feet because it is good for the larger ecosystem, not for the environment particularly.
I have never thought about it for a minute otherwise.
Right. Which is the way to look at it at the end of the day. As a finance person, that should be.
No, as a development person, as a policy person, it has to. If you're talking about subsidizing renewables for the future of our common planet, then I'm going to go back to saying, why should I subsidize? Let old Japanese people subsidize. If you're asking me to do something in my country to complete my development transformation, it had better be commercially viable. And there's something wrong in the regulatory environment or in the policy environment, fine, we'll have a conversation about that. But we're not in this to save the planet, we're in this to transform India. And this is an important thing.
That leads me to you now. I really want to understand the Spider-Man business. What was that?
I'll answer that in a bit. Let me save that till the end. Look, guys, there are probably 7 folks here from Renew. There are global scholars. These guys are bright-eyed, bushy-tailed students from the top universities around the world. They came in here very optimistic about India's energy transition. I fear we are disappointing them. So let me try and add some solutions and optimism here. First of all, I do want to come back to your point, sir, that there absolutely has to be an environmental objective and a climate change objective to some of the energy work that India does. It cannot only be economic development motivated. If that happens, not only India but the whole world will be in crisis. I want to talk about 3 points. And we can argue about this. Great. The first point I want to make relates to existing renewable energy. The types that have grown rapidly recently, wind and solar power. At Renew Power, by the way, full disclosure, we built those plants. The biggest gap that I see is something that Kanika has actually written about. It's not that we don't, there are a lot of risks that we know about, and renewables face those risks, whether it's counterparty risks or some risks inherent to the technology. But there are also a lot of risks that cause what she writes as the perceived risk gap between what the true risks are and what the financiers perceive the risks to be. And one way to bridge that gap, I believe, is better data. I want to talk about 3 kinds of data that we can try and assemble in order to make financing these assets a little more palatable. The first kind of data is production data. Renewable energy, to an investor, might seem like it has an uncertain production profile, but the more that you monitor how much a wind or a solar plant produces over multiple years, the better you'll be at forecasting the production of a brand new asset and thereby driving down the cost of capital for that asset. In the United States, a company startup called Kilowatt Hour Analytics has actually worked with Swiss Re, a large reinsurance company, to offer an insurance policy for production based on a massive data set on solar production around the United States and increasingly around the world. Inherent in making these forecasts is better data about resource potential. Wind and solar depend on the wind and the sun. At Renew Power, we have a new R&D project where we're going to try and do what you can do in the United States thanks to very enriched NASA data sets. We're going to cross-correlate satellite imagery from the Indian Meteorological Database to our data on the ground to determine, hey, can we get really good at forecasting what the wind and the solar potential will be year on year, month on month, day by day, so that we can tell you with great precision how much our plans will produce. You reduce that risk, you make it possible for financiers then to offer a lower cost of capital to these projects. The last kind of data I want to mention is reliability data. many of these projects, especially in the solar space, are quite young. But these projects are being financed for terms of 25 years or more. 25 years, typically. So, if we want financiers to take on this risk, we have to demonstrate to them that these projects are particularly reliable. One thing I advocate for is that in the solar space in particular, that we have standards of reliability testing, it's called accelerated lifetime testing, that are customized to the Indian context. Customized, for example, to deployment in these harsh environments in Rajasthan where you see a lot of solar plants coming up, rather than using the same International Electrotechnical Commission standards that one would use in Germany or the United States. Okay, that's my first of 3 points. I'll try to be fast. My second point builds on what Mr. Ahluwalia, Dr. Ahluwalia mentioned, which is it would be great for renewables to have a more diverse set of off-takers or market opportunities. I strongly believe that your idea about broadening the availability of renewable energy to service, for example, say a corporate off-taker, is a great idea. Going even more radically from this, in the Western world, the United States and Europe, we're seeing electricity market structures that are much more flexible. You have robust wholesale markets. You have, in some cases, you have capacity markets. You have these tailored market structures, such as short and long-term markets, that allow renewable energy generators to basically make agreements or trade with a vast range of participants, rather than the fairly shallow set of folks that they can currently sell power to today. That's another way of not just making electricity less risky, but allowing financiers who are best at assessing risk to assess a very complex, sophisticated problem and decide where they want to put their capital. The third point I want to make is the two technologies that I've been talking about, solar and wind, which are remarkable and they should continue growing, and I have a bone to pick with you on allocation compared with thermal. Those aren't the only two technologies we'll need for a decarbonized electricity sector in India, nor a decarbonized energy system. You're going to need a whole lot more technologies. You will need carbon capture and sequestration to deal with your continued use of coal power and coal for industrial purposes. You may need advanced nuclear energy here in India. You certainly will need long-duration storage solutions that don't look like lithium-ion batteries. Now, these are all technologies that today aren't deployed at the scale, certainly not of conventional thermal, and not even of renewable energy, which has become a fairly mature set of technologies in hydro, wind, and solar. We're going to need brand new policy support to convince financiers to support these new technologies. And these new technologies are certainly not de-risked enough for them to be commercially viable on their own. Innovation policy, however, is not monolithic. I think of innovation as a pipeline. They're very early innovations. There are innovations that need not just basic research, but applied development. There are innovations that need the first scale demonstration, and there are innovations ready to reach commercial viability. And each of these needs a different type of policy lever. So I'm happy to talk more about this, but to summarize, I think the government should invest in research, development, and demonstration, which starts to see the pipeline of innovations. And then it should support fairly technology-neutral incentives or other structures so that private investors can decide where to allocate capital toward the innovations that have made it this far in the pipeline. So let me stop there. I hope these are some solutions that convinces that there are concrete things we can do as companies working on data and as a government working on enabling the next generation of innovations to drive finance toward decarbonization. Because at the end of the day, there is an overriding motivation here. At least I believe it. I'm sure Kanika believes it, and I hope all these 7 global scholars believe it, which is India needs to decarbonize rapidly. It won't be as rapidly as the rest of as the United States, as Europe. They've got to do it even faster to give India space to develop. But India absolutely needs to start decarbonizing right now, and its emissions are going the wrong way.
So just to sort of summarize, I think, Varun, you answered a lot of the questions that I had for you. But do you feel that setting wind as we know it today, setting solar PV aside as we know it today, looking at some of the newer stuff out there, CST, CSP, some of the fancier stuff we talked about, do you think the finance folks at development institutions, at developers, let me put it that way, at independent power producers, are they able to get their heads around the risk that these technologies represent? Or are you saying, which is what I think you're saying, is that these newer technologies are going to need a lot more hand-holding in terms of policy support from the government.
They will need hand-holding. Look, technology risk is not something that many banks will do well with. I'll give you a small example. In energy storage, India is considering bringing on a lot of energy storage. The more renewable energy we have, the more intermittency we have, and therefore we need to store energy. And India is trying to do this thing where they kind of leapfrog what other countries have done. Other countries started with fairly small energy storage deployments, and now we have what's known as the dawn of mega storage, 100 megawatt hour projects. By leapfrogging, India might end up shooting itself in the foot by therefore its financiers will only support the most tried and true energy storage technologies. But even within lithium-ion batteries, the cobalt-rich lithium-ion variants may have a better time getting financing because they're more widely deployed than another variant called lithium iron phosphate. Lithium iron phosphate very well may be better for some Indian context because it can deal with higher ambient temperatures and tends to be cheaper as well. Look, if financiers are scared of investing in that first hundreds of megawatt hour project because they don't have a whole lot of experience investing in energy storage in India, then this tender may result in the wrong kind of energy storage deployment. That's not to say the ambition is wrong. The ambition is absolutely right. I do think, though, that we're going to need both small and large support for energy storage projects in India. So innovation requires a little bit of hand-holding to make sure we get the right technologies to put on the ground.
Sure, that sort of makes sense also, because I think if we look at the way solar and wind evolved, there has been a period of hand-holding. There has been a period of support from the government. And it's quite natural, I think, that some of the newer stuff will actually also need that. Prashant, I'm going to move to you now. And one of the things that sort of interests me and that I sort of look at and I find remarkable is the interplay between the bank lending market and the bond or the debt capital markets, in India versus overseas. The way I sort of like to look at it or think of it is that in India, the banks finance stuff that the bond market won't. Whereas overseas, it's the bond market that typically finances stuff that banks won't. And what that means is today, the bond market, which should be a big source of capital for independent power producers, at a project level or at a holdco level, at least domestically, is completely shut. But the same developers are able to go overseas and raise hundreds of millions of dollars at the drop of a hat, and at prices which are pretty competitive. What do you think is going to be required, or what do you think is needed for the domestic bond market to open up for renewables? And I'm talking about on a non-credit support basis, independently, either at an SPV level, either at a holdco level. What do you think needs to be done? Is it merely credit rating which needs to move into that A territory? So is the onus on the rating agencies here? Or is it something else? Or are we missing something?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that question. And you've introduced a whole bunch of very complicated issues which I'd like to sort of tackle in turn. Just in terms of the size of the internationals in the bond markets, it's something running of the order of $100 trillion. And of this, about the 400 largest institutional investors are in charge of about 85% of this. So in terms of the trillions of dollars, that's kind of where the bond market is now. I think at the moment the Indian rupee bond market is something in the order of 2 trillion, so it's quite substantial in some markets. Now, if you think about what the challenges are, and I like the way the question for this session has been framed. It's thinking of energy and fuel and juxtaposing those two issues. And if you think about, I'd like to draw an analogy of trying to refill a small scooter at a petrol station where the only pump is one of a large kind of diesel pump for lorries. Now, the basic problems we have with where you try to fill a motor scooter with something from this $100 trillion nozzle is one of volume. So in order to make some of these kind of bond deals from the international capital markets viable, you need to start raising capital in the hundreds of millions of US dollars. That's because the cost then will be 3 to 4% of that, and it's affordable then.
So size, you have to be big enough.
It has to be volume. Right. And even in the Indian INR markets, we're talking about tens of millions of dollars worth of things. So this problem I think you raised earlier of aggregation, that becomes a really big issue. We need to figure out how to actually aggregate individual projects and to do this. And I think yourselves, you've issued 2 bonds. The most recent one on the USD was, I think, about $300 million. And I think the interest rate costs were about 6%, plus, this is the crucial one, the cost of hedging.
Sure.
But when you try to issue a smaller INR bond, it was more like 9%, if I recollect. So, you can see that when you go to the foreign markets, you can get capital cheaper. You need to go at volume, so you need to think about aggregation. And then the second issue then with the petrol pump analogy is this petrol to diesel conversion. It's how do you go from USD to INR. At the moment, the hedging costs are quite prohibitive. I mean, they can range from something like 4% if you're going for sort of shorter term hedges, so anything up to 8%. You end up with Indian currency hedging costs being really quite unaffordable for the long-term hedges. You end up taking out very, very short-term loans, which is a problem when you've got investment assets which have got 30-year lifespans. And expecting them to pay this kind of huge surcharge in currency hedging costs undermines the whole economics of it.
So should we just blame the credit rating agencies here? Is it their fault?
Well, I mean, I agree with Shamila and Montek here that in a way, this issue of what is it that the credit rating agencies are working for the investors and the issuers in a sense. They're the people who actually they're trying to lubricate the interaction between those 2 agencies. Now, what they're being asked to do is look at the capacity of the issuer to repay the bond at the end of the tenor and consistently pay that rate of return. And they have to take into account the possibility or the probability of Indian currencies depreciating. And I think there's a debate to be had on whether they misprice that. I kind of agree with some of the comments I've read Kalika making that it is overpriced. I think it is.
Quickly, actually, you're right. But the main thing I think that affects the hedging risk is fear of volatility. And that is not just something that's up to India. So the real question is something happens in global financial markets which causes the rupee to go volatile. Then what is the kind of pushback loss that we will face? And therefore it's quite right that you would expect a country with a BBB- rating, who's a net importer, therefore whose foreign exchange reserves are not liquid, to face large amounts of hedge. But I just want to address one point, a good news point. For a long time, I was very suspicious, Neha, you remember this, when we used to speak, that I don't just want to see a rupee of bank money go into a rupee in the bond market. You want additionality in this country of resources. But now I'm beginning to think that if the green space is one in which we are able to articulate risk as precisely as you're claiming we can, which is good, then it is possible that if the bond market, if money shifts out of banks into the bond market, that will actually improve the health of the banking system by de-risking it. So there may be a case, and I'm rethinking my own thoughts, shifting for even a sort of initiative neutral shift of one rupee from the banks to the bond markets.
And you're talking the domestic bond market.
Domestic, right. International, for the reasons we said, it's going to be difficult. You mainly go for international money for the premium, which is not proven. And of course the additionality. I mean, the IRFC took $300 million, and I think it was good money. They got a reasonable premium. But the other thing, remember, in India is we don't have bond markets. We don't have nice bond markets. That number is very small. So my dream with green bonds is that because it actually calibrates very carefully the circumstances under which a bond is certified as green, and that has a very positive fiduciary knockback, this will actually construct assets that people are relatively confident in, and people who are not actually putting money into the banking system now, that's a difference Montek will know between our physical and financial savings, will actually come into these markets if we're able to sell them in, especially in tier 2 financial locations. So there is an additionality attempt specifically in green and climate bonds, which I have explored and I find quite positive.
Just stop your thought change till we discuss this further. We don't have the time now, but because this is something that we have discussed in the finance ministry, precisely what you said, maybe you can follow this up later.
I completely agree that the green bond market in particular is very interesting. At the moment, issuance is something like $170 billion a year. About 2.5% of all global issuance is now in the green bond markets. As Rutland says, this is from absolutely nothing 10 years ago. This is from 0 to 2.5% very, very quickly. And as Rutland says, the reason why international investors suddenly are looking at emerging markets through this green bond market lens is this kind of enhanced transparency. The kind of real differentiator for green bonds is often not anything. I mean, most bond investors are indifferent about the kind of greenhouse gas emissions, at least from the emerging markets.
I don't think there's much of a pricing benefit to be had by labeling it green.
We like to say that the pricing benefit is between about 12 and 15 basis points, but it's kind of anecdotal. That's a definition. But what people do really kind of admire is the kind of enhanced transparency. They know that when they actually lend, or the bond is raised, there's a process there for selecting projects. There's a very, very transparent usage of funds, and there's a process for verifying that that's how the funds are used afterwards. And if you look at a typical investor in the UK who's really quite limited knowledge and understanding of other markets, other economies, that kind of transparency is really sought after. And in fact, you talk to somebody in energy and some of the big investors, they might assign maybe a few percent, 4 or 5% of the emerging markets. So the whole of 6 billion people worth of population is assigned to this kind of category of emerging markets with relatively little differentiation for the generalist bond market. Obviously, the specialist.
And the developing country gets the risk officer. Because the country gets a bunch of parameters which give it confidence that, okay, somebody else other than me looking at these assets. That's the big advantage.
And that's why we're finding that. I think in India, something like of the green bonds, 1.6 billion so far have been in domestic currency and about 6 billion have been in US currency. It's actually an attractive way of accessing relatively cheap finance if you can figure out the hedging costs.
So I'm sure, bypassing the banks, which already load up a huge net interest margin, as it were, is logically the best way to raise, or cheapest way to raise money, particularly for something that's been execution risk mitigated, and particularly for something that doesn't have any supply risk. But Kanika, you had something to say too.
So I actually wanted to claw back a little bit in this discussion. Right? So you took a straw poll at the start of how we categorized ourselves in this room. But I'm sure that half of this room, including perhaps, if I may, several people who are supposed to make interventions, possibly fell asleep for a little moment when Varun started talking about lithium iron phosphates. And then equally, the minute you're talking about hedging prices and how many basis points you can save and country risk and are you going to be rated as junk, that all sounds like Latin and it's like, but my panels are good, why is it junk? Right? This is exactly what we need to bridge. And I actually agree with Varun that data is going to play a very important role in doing that. And Ratin, to your point, that there is a few steps to walk on educating investors and getting them to understand what are the incentives. And I agree actually with both Sharmila as well as Mr. Ahluwalia that if there is a good project, it will find the money, yes. But that's not sectoral. And the cost of the transaction cost on something like that, I'm sure a lithium iron phosphate project will also get financed today by a private bank. But it would be an outlier, it wouldn't. How do you get investors to be interested in renewables as a sector? And I think that all of my interventions are only questions today, but I think that that's what we should be debating.
I think before we close, I'm going to make my pitch as a government representative over here. Varun, this also answers some of what you said. A couple of the points that you spoke about, R&D especially. For me, that was the third point in your session for the day. The government needs to seriously look at incentivizing R&D in 3 areas. One of the things that is what Ratin had raised, no one's thinking about the disposal of solar panels. I mean, for me that's such a crisis, an impending crisis, and we're just oblivious of it in government. Again, it's not to be quoted, but anyway, this is something we need to look at. Because the disposal also has an environmental cost, so we have to think of that. 2, we do have schemes within government, it's tucked away in a couple of ministries, where something that is innovative but could be high risk, high cost, can be paid for. We have 2 streams, and these are all schemes which are doing very well. One which looks at the Israeli model of startups. That's working very well. And the other is in things like energy. At some point I'll give you the links, you can go and meet. Very competent scientists also sit on the panels. In fact, we don't have the usual babus like me selecting projects. It is actual scientists and specialists. The third is on the rating that you had mentioned. India was the first country to develop a credit rating for infrastructure, where unlike, we have 2 models now. We have the probability of default and the expected loss. And the rating agencies, before they've recently come under a cloud, have also offered to do a green tagging of projects that they're rating, where exactly what I think both of you were talking about, you could rate a project based upon sustainability built into the design, into the construction, into the O&M. And depending on that, a potential investor could examine that. This would be in parallel to the traditional rating and say, okay, this ticks all the boxes for me in terms of the sustainability factors. But most important, Varun, as government, I think we are worse than dogmatics when it comes to about the environment. I mean, a leaf off a tree makes us panic, but somewhere we have to balance the developmental needs with the environment. I'm a closet green, so whatever I say as an infrastructure finance person actually clashes with what I feel as a closet green. But as a government, we are fully committed to the need to build in sustainability in every aspect of infrastructure development that we do. This is just because I think I wanted to allay those kind of concerns, including in the young minds out here who may think we are not.
And thank you, ma'am. That absolutely makes sense. But I want to be clear, there's a lot of good techno-economic analysis out there in the academic literature. Kanika's talked about the modeling that tells us that decarbonization is possible, and we're only doing some of the things in order to accomplish it here in India. Mr. Ahluwalia's idea of a tax with teeth, $40, $50 a ton, I think that's 3,000 rupees a ton of carbon dioxide, that will hit the coal sector hard, great idea. And it's true both in this country as well as the country I'm from, the United States. That's something we absolutely need there. There's a variety of other ways that you can ensure that another coal plant doesn't get built in India, and that renewable energy can meet the incremental demand, which will be enormous here in India, 30, 40 gigawatts a decade, that we can meet it with clean sources of energy. And if we need to burn thermal energy, we need to find ways to capture and sequester the carbon. So these we need to take as givens. We absolutely need to accomplish these things. I think there are reasonable solutions to achieve them, both from a techno-economic point of view as well as from a pure financing point of view. And that's the way we've got to look at this problem.
I think, Kanika, 5 minutes, your time is up. You want to just say a few words as we close?
Yeah, actually, I think that this was, from my point of view, helpful even in identifying perhaps what are the gaps and challenges. And I'd like to offer possibly a half-step solution, at least to get us a little bit further ahead, which is the CEEW Center for Energy Finance, which we will be launching tomorrow. And it's actually, it's predicated on the very premise that there is, if there was more information available and if you could hedge the information asymmetry and not just the currency fluctuations, if you could hedge that information asymmetry, there would be a lot more transactions. Because there is a pipeline of good projects. It doesn't always come in sort of running water style, but it exists. And then there is equally capital looking for homes. But can we provide the kinds of data that Warren talked about? Can we provide information in ways that where you bridge the gap between those who talk megawatt and those who talk dollars, so that can you build a common narrative and some amount of coherence in the sector, so that there is more capital at play, at least for technologies at scale, and then bespoke solutions that can help other early stage technologies to reach that market scale. So after all of my questions, I'm offering a semi-solution to end this session. So thank you very much.